We live in the midst of invisible forces whose effects alone we perceive. We move among invisible forms whose actions we very often do not perceive at all, though we may be profoundly affected by them. This is a quote from this very book titled Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune. These may be simple words, even philosophical in nature, and yet possibly a testimonial from personal experience from the author. As vague as these words are, they even resonate the truth of science without the complicated math formulas and nomenclatures. Hello, I am Daisy, your hostess. To my family, friends, and community, welcome back. And if you are new to the channel, glad you found me. I must give you the heads up, this is an eclectic space. Don't judge a book by its cover, so to speak. There's a lot going on in this community. Come join me, have a seat here. I'd like to paint a picture, so to say, of what is going on here. It feels like we are sitting in a parlor room having high tea with the author, Dion Fortune. She's sharing some of her experiences with regards to the phenomena of psychic attacks, and because of her background in psychology, she's laying the groundwork that, while some things can not be explained, there's a lot more that can be, because it has to do with constructs of the mind. The task is in eliminating one before addressing the other. Again, due to the nature of this content, I have said this in the previous video, because we are continuing on with this read, I am inclined to forewarn you that this topic is very delicate, and if your mind is prone to speedy imaginations and vivid fantasies, I would recommend clicking off. There are terms here mentioned which the author does not expand on, given that she's casting a wide net for those that are new and those that are adepts, meaning that someone not familiar with certain terms should take the time to become familiar with them before moving on through the chapters. I will take a few minutes here to highlight some of the terms that will be introduced in these chapters so we are all on the same footing, and as usual, I will leave links in the description of this video so you can take it from there. I will agree with the author on that psychic attacks are far more commoner than is generally realized, but I'm adding a caveat, and that is that today I would consider mental manipulation and suggestive programming as mild forms of psychic attacks. Some of it may be innocent, and it goes on in every household, relationship, and workplace among peers, but there are instances where it is not so innocent and is used in business and commerce for profit, though not necessarily deliberately evil. There are techniques used in sales, advertising, in attracting the opposite sex, or drawing to oneself money and success. You can find organizations and individuals offering courses without too much struggle. Tell me that it's not so. You know it, I know it. The power comes in knowing and understanding when you are being manipulated or handled, whether it be from someone close or an advertisement or even your government. Eyes wide open is a good way to walk in life, even though I do agree ignorance can sometimes be blissful until it hurts. Another term that the author will mention throughout the book is the Great White Lodge, and that's a concept introduced by Helena Blavatsky. She's the founder of the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, and it was building on earlier ideas of secret orders of mystics, kind of like the Rosicrucians, if some of you have heard that, which were established in the 17th century. Blavatsky claimed that she had made physical contacts with adepts, early representatives in Tibet, but also that she continued to receive teachings from them through psychic channels. So the Great White Lodge was their meeting place, and from there emerged the Great White Brotherhood, secret council of sages who were masters of the ancient wisdom. In these next chapters, the author introduces us to the left-hand path and the right-hand path. These seem quite self-explanatory, but for sake of clarity, I'll go ahead and give a little explanation here. Occult and religious paths are sometimes divided into two categories, the left-hand path and the right-hand path. There are many religions and spiritual practices in each path. And the left-hand path is considered to be all about the elevation and the centrality of the self, as well as the rejection of religious authority, as well as societal taboos. Satanism and Luciferianism are considered left-hand paths. Mind you, there are many branches of these, just like in Christianity. Now, the right-hand path is one of dogma, ritual, and a belief in the community and of formal structure, as well as a higher power. Though each of these also can be found in the left-hand path religions. In the right-hand path, there is less focus on indulging on the self. The vast majority of religions are considered part of the right-hand path, from Christianity to Wicca. One may deduce that when it comes to the world of psyche, we are dealing with the realm of the mind, but it could be a little bit more. I found an article in nature.com by Richard C. Henry, a professor of physics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins University, that might shed light on this. He stated that, historically, we have looked to our religious leaders to understand the meaning of our lives, the nature of our world. Galileo Galilei succeeded in believing the unbelievable himself, but he also convinced almost everyone else to do the same when he proposed that the earth goes around the sun. In doing this, he established the beginning of modern classical physics. Later, physics joined religion in seeking to explain our place in the universe with the work of Isaac Newton. For those that are seeking those great profound answers of life, there are many roads to choose, be it through the sciences, philosophy, or religion. The thing is, too often those truth seekers are loners, and there are others that are looking outside themselves and somehow end up in cliques without researching too much about the founders of the organizations that they're joining, which could be leading them into dark places, no pun intended. But I digress, because I am taking you somewhere regarding this realm we are in, this mental universe, so bear with me. With the 1925 discovery of quantum mechanics, again, we are being led to believe the unbelievable, this time that the universe is mental. While there are some physicists that find it difficult to accept the view that the substratum of everything is of mental character, I invite you to look up what is called the Renninger type experiments. These are thought experiments which was first proposed by Mauritius Renninger in 1953 that explore quantum measurement by demonstrating that the non-detection of a particle can also constitute a measurement. In these experiments, he illustrated the concept of wave function collapse through a thought experiment involving a particle's quantum state, not its physical detection. The experiment sets up a scenario where a particle is in a superposition of possible locations, and the non-detection of the particle in one region is interpreted as a collapse of its wave function to a different region, even without direct interaction. So the core idea is that a negative outcome, a non-detection, can provide information as meaningful as a positive outcome or detection, implying a measurement has occurred in the non-detection. So stay with me. We are indeed dealing with unseen forces, and I kind of want to illustrate here how we've had through the ages, from those primitive ancient times, and us growing and learning and questioning things from not only the physical sense, from the science sense, but from all aspects. And I will come full circle. I am navigating through some philosophy and science and using these as tools to remove fear. And fear sometimes comes out of ignorance, and fear is no friend of light and wisdom. So, to add an understanding of the word psychic, we go to the field of etymology, the study of words and their origins. So we're going into different schools of thought, right? Not only philosophy and science, and religion also, faith. So here, the Greeks take credit for the introduction of this word into the human vocabulary, as it appeared first in the written form in the Iliad by Homer, written down in the 8th century BC. So the Greek word psychikos, meaning natural or of the soul, but really basically life breath, was associated with a person's life force. It then resurged in the New Testament, written in Koine Greek in the books of the Corinthians and Jude, with its modern psychological meaning developing through the philosophical and theological developments fully established in the 20th century, that it went from meaning life breath to soul and mind. Yet, did the Greeks get it right when they defined psychikos? A life breath of the soul, or is it a combination of the soul projecting through the mind? And are psychic attacks but mere constructs between one's mind and that which one fears? I'm sure you've heard the saying, we are limited by our own mind, by our own thoughts and our imagination. Or are psychic attacks between two minds where there is a dominance and a submission force? Or is it a collective mental construct being used by elites for said purpose of control and manipulation? I'll leave you to think on that. The threshold of the unseen is a treacherous coast on which to bathe. There are potholes and currents and quicksands. The strong swimmer who knows the coast may venture in comparative safety. The non-swimmer who takes counsel of nothing but his own impulses may pay for his temerity with his life. Quote by Dion Fortune. And as the author opens discussion on analyzing the nature of psychic attacks, talks of modern witchcraft and projecting the etheric body, all seem so outlandish, and I beg to ask, is the universe real? But what makes it real to all of us? Yet great philosophers and poets have entertained that there is a simple answer, and that is that we have one mind and we are participating in the same dream. So perhaps Professor Henry's right. The universe to all of us is in our mind and everything else that we create. And that is where I wanted to land on this intro, just to give you that broad aspect of the constructs and of the power of the mind. So let me know you were here. Hit the like button and share your thoughts. Leave a comment. I will in turn hit the like button on your comment as well. And now I turn the page. Chapter 2. Analysis of the nature of psychic attack. The essence of a psychic attack is to be found in the principles and operations of telepathic suggestion. If we put together what we know of telepathy and what we know of suggestion, we shall understand its modus operandi. Suggestion is of three kinds: autosuggestion, conscious suggestion, and hypnotic suggestion. The distinction, however, is not as fundamental as at first sight appears, for the goal of all suggestion in the subconscious mind is the same, and they do not become operative until it is reached. Suggestion is distinguished from threats and appeals to reason by the fact that these aim at a mark in the conscious mind. If they succeed, they owe their success to the acquiescence of the conscious personality, whether coerced or voluntary. But suggestion does not make its appeal to consciousness, but aims at laying its hands upon the springs of action in the subconscious and manipulating them from there. We might compare these two processes to the operation of pulling all the bell knob outside the front door and taking up a floorboard and twitching the bell wires themselves. The result will be the same in both cases. The bell will ring. Threats and argument pull the bell knob with varying degrees of emphasis, from the persistent tinkling of moral suasion to the resounding peal of the blackmailer. Suggestion twitches the wires at various points in their course. Autosuggestion is given by one's own conscious mind to one's own subconscious mind. Now, you may ask, why can I not give orders to my subconscious mind direct without having to resort to the paraphernalia of suggestion? The answer to this question is very simple. The subconscious mind belongs to a much earlier phase of evolution than the conscious mind. It belongs, in fact, to a phase prior to the development of speech. To address it in words, therefore, is like speaking to a man in a language he does not understand. In order to deal with him, we must have resort to sign language. So it is with the subconscious mind. It is no use to say to it, do this or don't do that. We must make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in consciousness till it begins to sink into the subconsciousness. The subconscious mind will understand this picture and act upon it. The actor who wishes to cure himself of stage fright will fail to do so if he says to his subconscious mind, "Don't be frightened." For a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. Equally, if he makes a mental picture of stage fright and says to his subliminal self, "Now don't do that," the result will be disastrous. For the subliminal self will see the picture and omit the negative, because the word "not" means nothing to it. In order to handle the subconscious mind effectually, we make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in mind by repeated applications until the subconsciousness begins to be influenced and takes up the task of its own accord. This is the end result of all suggestion, and the different kinds of suggestions are distinguished not by the difference in end result, but by the gate through which they enter the subconscious mind. Autosuggestion originates in our own consciousness. Waking suggestion originates in the mind of another and is conveyed to our mind by the ordinary channels of the spoken or written word. Hypnotic suggestion enters the subconscious mind direct without impinging upon consciousness at all. Hypnotic suggestion, which means literally suggestion made during sleep and is to some extent a misnomer, is of three kinds. Firstly, true hypnotic suggestion made when the subject has been rendered insensible by magnetic passes or fixation of the eyes on a bright object. Secondly, suggestion given during normal sleep, as Kui advises, should be done with children. In my opinion, a most undesirable proceeding. And thirdly, telepathic suggestion. All these modes of suggestion enter the mind behind the sensor. That is to say, they are independent of consciousness, which is neither asked to co-create nor has the power to inhibit them. In most cases, suggestions made in this way are never recognized as coming from outside, but are only discovered after they have matured in the subconsciousness and are beginning to take effect. We do not see the invisible seed that has been sown in our mind by the mind of another, but in due course germination takes place and the strong growing shoot appears above the threshold of consciousness as if it were a native growth. The skillful suggestionist always aims at making his suggestions harmonize with the bias of the personality, for if they do not, the established subconscious complexes will expel them before they have time to strike root. All he can really do is to reinforce and stimulate the ideas and impulses that are already there, though perhaps latent. He cannot plant an entirely alien seed. He cannot graft a rose shoot on a lilac bush, for it will merely wither and die. For growth of the thought seeds of suggestion to take place, they must find a congenial soil. It is herein lies the strength of the defense. We may not be able to prevent the minds of others from sending us suggestions, but we may so purify the soil of our own natures that no harmful ones can find a congenial seedbed. It is a simple matter to pull up a seedling nettle, but it is quite a different business to eradicate a thick-set bank of tangled roots and stinking shoots many years old. It has been said, and not untruly, that a person cannot be hypnotized into doing anything which is contrary to his real nature. But what is the real nature of each one of us? Have we all overcome the ape and tiger, or are they merely caged? Suggestion can unbar the cage of all our secret temptations and let them loose upon us. None but the saint is naturally immune. It is possible to reduce anybody to anything, provided suggestion has unchecked scope for a sufficient length of time. The purest woman can be made a harlot, the noblest man a murderer under certain conditions. Knowledge is necessary to protect, and it is that knowledge which I intend to give in these pages. Let us now consider exactly how a psychic attack operates. In the realms of mind, there is neither time nor space as we understand them. I do not propose to argue this statement philosophically, but state it as a fact of experience which anyone who is accustomed to operating on the inner planes will have shared. If we think of a person, we are in touch with that person. If we picture them clearly, it is as if we were face to face with them. If we picture them vaguely, it is as if we saw them in the distance. Being in the mental vicinity of a person, we can create a thought atmosphere by dwelling upon certain ideas in connection with him. This is how spiritual healing is done. The affirmations of Christian Science are used in order to get the mind of the healer into a certain emotional state, and his condition effectually influences the mind of the patient with whom he has put himself en rapport. This power, however, can be used for evil as well as good. The founder of Christian Science was wise enough to put her teaching in such a way that her students would not readily discern the second edge of the sword. As long as the world in general was ignorant of the powers of the mind, it was better that nothing should be said by those who knew, because the knowledge, if spread broadly, indiscriminately, might do more harm than good, giving information to those who ought not to have it. But now that so much is generally known and even practiced concerning the powers of human mind, it is as well that the real facts should also be known and the whole matter brought out into the open. And as far as lies in my power, I am prepared to do this. Any message to the subconscious mind must be couched in very simple terms, because subconscious thought is a primitive form of mentation, developed before spoken language was to mankind. The primary aim of the suggestion is to create a mental atmosphere about the soul of the person, whether that person is to be attacked or healed, until a sympathetic response or reaction is elicited within the soul itself. I use the term soul to include both the mental and emotional processes, but to exclude the spiritual ones. Once this creation is achieved, the battle is half over, for the gate of the city has been opened from within, and there is free ingress. The telepathic suggestion of definite ideas can now proceed rapidly. It is this point which is the critical one in any occult attack. Up to this point, the defender has the advantage. If he has sufficient knowledge, the knowledge I hope to make available through this book, he can without any undue exertion retain that advantage indefinitely, and wear his attackers down, even if unable to meet them on their own ground of occult knowledge. There is nothing in this world or the next that a hypnotist can do with the person who keeps his nerve and won't pay attention. There are two gates, and two only, by which the attacker can gain entrance to the city of man's soul, and these are the self-preservation instinct and the sex instinct. The hypnotic appeal must be couched in terms of one or both of these if it is to be successful. How does the attacker proceed? He has to create an atmosphere about the soul of his victim on the inner planes. He can only do this by creating that atmosphere within his own consciousness while he thinks of his victim. If he wants to perform a psychic murder, he must fill his own soul with the rage of destruction until it overflows. If he wants to perform a psychic rape, he must fill his soul with lust and cruelty. The cold rage of cruelty is essential to effectual operations of this nature. Now, what happens when he does this? He has sounded a ringing keynote in the abyss. It will be answered. All beings who have this keynote for the basis of their nature will respond. Dark Uriel and Azrael and Amon on the wing, and will join in the operation. But they do not operate direct upon the victim. They work through the operator. It is like the old game of nuts and may, in which the one who is sent to fetch her way is gripped around the waist of the leader of a chain of supporters. The real pressure comes on his own abdominal muscles, as anyone who has played the game will remember. And when the magical operation is over, what then? Will the operator be left to enjoy his victim in peace? Is it likely? This is the mystical basis of the story of Faust. The devil might be not only willing but anxious to enable Dr. Faustus to win Margarita, but he came for his soul at the appointed time. We may also remember that if Margarita had not responded to the lure of the jewel song, she would not have fallen a victim. The weak spot in the defense was, after all, in her own nature. We have considered the modus operandi of telepathic suggestion in detail because it forms the real basis of every kind of occult attack. Whether it be a discarnate entity, a being of another order of evolution, a demon from the pit, or merely the panic-stricken soul of a selfish friend, clinging to the life of form regardless of consequences, in all cases, the opening gambit is the same. Until the aura is pierced, there can be no entrance to the soul, and the aura is always pierced from within by the response of fear or desire going out towards the attacking entity. If we can inhabit that instinctive emotional reaction, the edge of the aura will remain impenetrable and will be as sure a defense against psychic invasion as the healthy and unbroken skin is a defense against the bacterial infection. It happens sometimes, however, that a rapport has been formed with the attacking entity in a previous incarnation, and therefore it holds, as it were, the key to the postern. Such a problem is a very difficult one, and external assistance is needed for its solution. The difficulty is increased by the fact that the victim is often disinclined to allow the break to be made, being bound to the attacking entity, whether discarnate or incarnate, by bonds of fascination or even genuine affection. A case with which I was acquainted throws so much light on various aspects of psychic interference by incarnate souls operating out of their bodies that it is of value to quote it at length. In the summer of 1926, I saw in the papers a short paragraph describing the death of a certain man and his wife, which took place within a few hours of each other. A couple of years previously, I had been consulted by a friend of the wife who was deeply perturbed about the state of affairs and suspected psychic interference. The wife, Mrs. C, we will call her, had begun to be troubled by nightmares, waking up in a state of intense fear, hearing the echoes of menacing words ringing in her ears. At about the same time, the husband, Mr. C, developed what at first sight looked like epileptic fits. A careful diagnosis by specialists, however, determined that although epileptiform, they were not true epilepsy. Epilepsy is due either to a congenital tendency whose nature is not fully understood by medical science, or to some injury or disease of the brain. In congenital epilepsy, the disease shows itself early in life. In fits due to disease, other symptoms are present which can be detected by a physical examination, such as changes in the eye that are revealed by the ophthalmoscope. The diagnosis can therefore be definitely established. Moreover, there is one sure sign by means of which an epileptic fit can be distinguished with certainty from a hysterical or psychic seizure. In true epilepsy, the urine is involuntary, voided in the course of the fit. This is a sure sign, and when it is absent, we are safe in saying that the fit is not epileptic, whatever else it may be. This is a useful point for those who have to deal with the pathologies that afflict the psychic temperament, for they will see plenty of seizures, and a sure method of distinguishing those that are of organic origin is very useful. We must not, however, conclude that all cases of such incontinence are epileptics, for there are many other causes, both organic and functional. In the case of Mr. C, this cardinal symptom was lacking. The attacks, moreover, always took place in sleep, and it seemed as if they were more of the form of severe nightmare, verging on somnambulism. It was a curious factor in the case that Mrs. C's nightmares usually heralded Mr. C's attacks. These occurrences showed a certain cyclic regularity, occurring about once a month. In the case of a woman, this would naturally be referred to the 28-day cycle of her nature, but in the case of man, no such explanation was forthcoming, and we therefore had to look for another 28-day cycle to explain his periodicity. The only other cycle of this period is that of the phases of the moon. We were then confronted by a correlation of epileptiform attacks which had no organic basis, the nightmares of the second person, and the phases of the moon. Some theory had to be found which would resume these three and explain their interrelationship. A dream is commonly the first way in which psychic manifestations make themselves known, the subconscious perceptions being reflected into consciousness in this form. It is held by many occultists that congenital epilepsy, as distinguished from that due to tumors of the brain, has its roots in the operations of black magic or witchcraft in which the sufferer participated in a past life, whether as a practitioner or victim, the fit being an astral struggle with discarnate entity, reflected on the physical body by means of the well-known phenomena of repercussion. The moon plays a very important part in all occult operations, different tides being available at different phases of her cycle. Persephone, Diana, and Hecate, all aspects of Luna, are three very different persons. It therefore appeared probable that as the physical investigation had drawn blank, a psychic investigation might yield fruits. One was performed, and with the following results. Nothing at all was discerned with regard to Mrs. C. She was merely what lawyers call an accessory after the fact. But the psychic trail of Mr. C was soon picked up and followed, and it appeared that in his last incarnation he had been associated with two women, mother and daughter, who had practiced witchcraft for his benefit. The younger of the two women had been for a short time his mistress. Mother and daughter had paid the penalty for their crimes, but their male partner had escaped. The diagnosis was as follows. It is the younger witch that is at the bottom of the trouble. It is her astral visits which cause the seizures of Mr. C and the nightmares of Mrs. C, and they correlate with the phases of the moon because certain phases are favorable for the operations she performs, and she therefore takes advantage of them. The question now remains, is this woman in incarnation or not? That is to say, is the midnight visit paid in an astral body projected from a living human being or by an earthbound spirit which has succeeded in evading the second death? Mrs. C had by now been taken into the confidence of the mutual friend who was concerned for her welfare, and lent a ready ear to the suggestion that some psychic influence might be at the bottom of the trouble. For this explanation coincided with her own intuitions in the matter, intuitions she had not dared to divulge for fear of ridicule. When asked if she could identify anyone in the circle of her husband's acquaintances who might prove to be the younger witch, she replied immediately that she could without any difficulty identify both the women and told the following curious story. The older witch she identified as her husband's mother, an aged lady who occupied a suite of rooms in their house. For this inoffensive old creature, Mrs. C had always had a peculiar horror and repulsion, although admitting there were no rational grounds for it, and honestly endeavoring to do her duty by her. So great was her horror of the old lady that she would never remain in the house after her husband had left for his office in the morning, but went out herself to her club if she had no other engagement. Among the frequenters of the house was an intimate friend of the elder Mrs. C, a woman of peculiar psychic temperament, who always called the old lady mother and was singularly attached to her. She was also very attached to Mr. C, but her feelings never exceeded, outwardly at any rate, the bounds of propriety, and Mr. C, who was sincerely attached to his own wife, never paid the slightest attention to her, looking upon her as his mother's friend and as such to be tolerated. Mrs. C unhesitatingly identified Miss X, as we will call her, as the younger witch. Enquiries were then made regarding her history, and a very curious story unfolded. As a young girl, she had become engaged to a man who, soon after the engagement was announced, had developed galloping consumption and died after a short illness with a violent hemorrhage. Soon after this, Miss X's sister also became engaged, and by a strange fatality, her lover shared the same fate, dying as died the other man in a flood of his own blood. Years went by, and Miss X became engaged again. Soon the second lover fell ill, not this time with galloping consumption, but with a more lingering form of the complaint, in which hemorrhage was the principal symptom. He seemed to linger on from the hemorrhage to hemorrhage, and this went on for years. Miss X, a woman of considerable private means, took a house, installed an aunt as a chaperone, and took her fiancé to live there and be nursed by her. Soon the aunt developed symptoms of illness. She appeared to be drained of all vitality and for days at a time would lie unconscious, but no specific cause was ever discovered for her illness. The peculiar menage continued for years, Miss X living in her big house with these two moribund creatures lingering on from attack to attack. She was a constant visitor at the home of the C's, both during the lifetime of Mr. C's first wife and that of his second, the friend of my friend. On the death of Mr. C's first wife, she had great hopes, it was observed, that his attentions would turn towards herself, but they did not. Nevertheless, she swallowed her chagrin and succeeded in maintaining her foothold as an intimate friend of the family when the new Mrs. C came to preside over the household. Certain methods of protections were suggested to Mrs. C which helped her considerably, but it was not possible to exclude Miss C from the house owing to her intimacy with the old lady. In due course, however, old Mrs. C was gathered to her father's, and then young Mrs. C put her foot down and said she would have no more to do with Miss X. Mr. C concurred in this, as he had always had a repulsion for Miss X and had only tolerated her for his mother's sake. Soon after this, Mrs. C began to feel unwell. The indisposition slowly progressed, until finally, although she had no definite symptoms, she was obliged to consult a doctor on account of her steadily increasing weakness and sense of malaise. A diagnosis of rapidly growing cancer of the womb was made. An operation was performed, which gave temporary relief. It was not expected to do any more, and she went downhill steadily. Towards the end, she lapsed into unconsciousness, and at the same time, Mr. C also became unconscious, apparently having one of his seizures in sleep, from which he never awakened. They died within a few hours of each other. Mr. C's first wife had also died of cancer of the womb. About this time, Miss X, aunt, and fiancé died within a short time of each other, and the last that was heard of Miss X was that she had been removed to a nursing home in the country with a severe mental breakdown. Taken separately, any of the incidents in this strange, eventful history can be explained away, but taken together, they make a curious story, especially when it is remembered that without any previous information, a psychic investigation had spotted the existence of a person with abnormal faculties who was interested in Mr. C. Cancer is a disease upon which certain occult hypotheses throw a good deal of light. It is believed to be a disease of the etheric double, not of the physical body, and that a cancer elemental is the infective factor. To prove or disprove anything concerning the foregoing story is impossible, but the following occult hypothesis may explain much. If this hypothesis be not accepted, readers may find an interesting exercise for their ingenuity in constructing another that shall explain more satisfactorily the circumstance of the case. Miss X retained subconsciously the knowledge and powers that had been hers during the previous life when she was implicated in the witch cult. She also retained her passion for Mr. C, a passion which was obviously unrequited. She employed her power of projection of the astral body to visit Mr. C at night during sleep. In the absence of details, it is impossible to decide definitely whether the fit of Mr. C was a struggle or an embrace. It might be either, or it might be both, an initial struggle ending in an embrace. The dreams of Mrs. C obviously related to the same astral visitant who caused the seizures of Mr. C. There is unfortunately no record to show at what phase of the moon these attacks took place, but presumably at the Hecate phase, which is the period of evil witchcraft. The condition of Miss X's fiancé and aunt and the death of her first lover point markedly towards vampirism. It is difficult to believe that a consumptive would continue for so many years without his disease either being checked or making definite progress. It is difficult to say what the connection, if any, might be between Miss X and the death of her sister's lover, but it is a curious thing that 3 men associated with this ill-omened household as prospective husbands should lose their lives in the same way. This, together with the mysterious illness of the aunt, are very suspicious. As noted before, any one of these incidents could be explained away, but taken together, they call for thought. It is also curious that Miss X should keep her fiancé in her house and yet not marry him. From every normal point of view, an arrangement with many drawbacks and no advantages. On the other hand, if her feelings were fixed upon Mr. C and were obtaining satisfaction by astral visits, she would naturally not want to break her rapport with the man she loved by giving herself to the man she did not love. If she were a vampire, her motive for keeping the aunt and lover in her house and their condition would be readily explained. Also her breakdown, which followed immediately upon her deaths. The fact that Mr. C's first wife died of cancer of the womb does not in itself call for remark, but it is a curious thing that he should lose his second wife from the same disease. Cancer is not as common as all that, and in any case, there are many available sites besides the womb. On the other hand, Diana, one of the aspects of Luna, of whom Hecate, the goddess of witches, was another, presides over the female reproductive organs. The illness of Mrs. C began to show itself soon after Miss X was excluded from the house. Finally, what shall we say concerning the deaths of 3 people most intimately associated with Miss X within a short time of each other, and her immediate breakdown? In the absence of details, any conclusion must be guesswork, but we have good grounds for supposing that Miss X's magical operations were attended by some mishap. It may be said that such a theory is the wildest improbability and does violence to all the laws of evidence. Let it, however, be borne in mind that 2 years before the matters eventuated, the work of a witch in connection with Mr. C's epileptiform attacks was suspected, and the nature of her relationship to him was indicated, and subsequent enquiries revealed the curious facts in the connection with Miss X's history and menage. Let it also be noted that the happenings which subsequently occurred are such as have been recorded in many accounts of witch trials. It is a scientific maxim that the power to foretell the course of phenomena is a good indication of the truth of a theory. End of chapter. Chapter 3. A Case of Modern Witchcraft. The part played by the ex-witch in occult attack is very marked. Again and again do the investigations of independent psychics point to witchcraft in a previous incarnation when trouble of this sort is afoot. The motive is nearly always vengeance, but there is also good reason to believe that the projection of the astral body takes place involuntarily during sleep, and is not deliberately willed by the offender. Very many people who are at present psychics and sensitives got their training in the covens of medieval witchcraft, and for this reason experienced occultists are very wary of the natural psychic as distinguished from the initiate with his technique of psychism. Where psychism and mental unbalance are found conjoined with a malevolent disposition, there is strong presumption that the cult of Diabolus is not far to seek. A curious set of happenings, in which I myself was one of the actors, throws a good deal of light on this by no means uncommon occurrence. It was in the early days of my interest in occultism, when I was still buying experience by the expensive but effectual method of running my head into obstacles. I made the acquaintance of a woman who was interested in psychic matters. She was a person of the most extreme sensitiveness to anything unclean or ugly, fastidious to a degree in her personal habits, living almost exclusively on uncooked vegetarian foods, even refusing eggs as too stimulating. Although not an animal lover, she was morbidly humanitarian, reading with gusto those papers which gave lurid and detailed descriptions of vivisection of experiments. Had I been older and wiser, I should have recognized the significance of her ultra-cleanliness and ultra-sensitiveness as marking the apt reaction of a sadistic temperament, sadism being a pathology of the emotional nature in which the sex instinct takes the form of an impulse to inflict pain. Not having learnt then many things which I now know, I looked upon her characteristics as indicative of an exalted spirituality. At the time I knew her, she was verging on a breakdown which was alleged to be due to overwork, and she was very anxious to get away from cities and back to nature. I was just leaving London to take up my residence at an Oakhill college, which was hidden away in the sandy fastness of the Hampshire Barrens. In the innocence of my heart, I suggested that she might come down there and help with the domestic duties. The suggestion was acted upon, and a few days after my own arrival, Miss L. joined us. She seemed quite normal, made herself agreeable, and was well liked. One incident, however, in the light of subsequent events, was significant. On getting out of the ancient fly in which she had driven from the station, she immediately went and patted the still more ancient horse that drew it. That beast, usually sunk in an apathy from which he was with difficulty roused when action was required of him, galvanized into life at her touch, as if she had stung him. He threw up his head, backed, snorted, and nearly turned the equipage over the ditch, to the amazement of his Jehu, who declared he had never known to do such a thing before, and viewed our visitor with disfavor. Miss L., however, appeared quite normal, made herself agreeable, and was given a friendly reception by the humans at any rate. That night I was awakened by a nightmare, a thing to which I am not usually subject. I struggled with a weight on my chest, and even after consciousness had fully returned, the room seemed full of evil. I performed such simple banishing formula as I knew, and peace was restored. At breakfast next morning, an assembly of blear-eyed people met together, complaining of having passed disturbed nights. We compared notes, and found we had all, some 6 or 7 of us, had similar nightmares and proceeded to exchange experiences. The effect of this upon Miss L was curious. She squirmed upon her chair as if it had suddenly become red-hot, and said with much emphasis, "These things should not be discussed. It is most unwholesome." Out of deference to her feelings, we desisted, but presently up to the open window came another member of our community, a woman who slept in an open-air shelter at some little distance from the house. We inquired after her health, as usual, and she replied that she was not feeling very well, as she had slept badly, and proceeded to recount the same nightmare as the rest of us. Later on in the morning, another lady, who had a house a little way down the road, arrived, and she, in her turn, told of a similar nightmare. These nightmares continued, on and off for the next few days, to afflict different members of the community. They were vague and nebulous, and there was nothing we could pitch upon for diagnostic purposes, and we put it down to indigestion caused by the village baker's version of war bread. Then, one day, I had a quarrel with Miss L. She had conceived a crush for me. I have a constitutional repulsion for crushes and give them scant politeness, and she complained bitterly of my lack of responsiveness. Whatever may be the rights and wrongs of the case, I had roused her resentment in good earnest. That night I was afflicted with the most violent nightmare I have ever had in my life, waking from sleep with a terrible sense of oppression on my chest, as if someone were holding me down or lying upon me. I saw distinctly the head of Miss L, reduced to the size of an orange, floating in the air of the foot of my bed, and snapping its teeth at me. It was the most malign thing I have ever seen. Still, not attaching any psychic significance to my experiences and being firmly convinced that the local baker was responsible, I told no one of my dream, thinking it one of those things that are better kept to oneself. But when the members of the community came to talk matters over in the light of subsequent events, we found that 2 other people had had similar experiences. A night or 2 later, however, as it came to bedtime, I was overcome with a sense of impending evil, as if something dangerous were lurking in the bushes around the house, threatening attack. So strong was this sensation that I came down from my room and went all around the house, testing the catches of the windows to make sure that all was secure. Miss L heard me and called out to know what I was doing. I told her of my feelings. "You silly child," she said. "It is no use latching the windows. The danger is not outside the house, but in it. Go to bed, and be sure and lock your door." She would give no answer to my questions except to reiterate that I should lock my door. This was the first night I had slept in that house, previously having been in a cottage on the opposite side of the road. I did not lock my door because the night was intolerably hot and the room and the window small. I compromised, however, by putting an enamel slot pail at a strategic spot in the fairway, trusting that any intruder would fall over it and give the alarm. Nothing happened, and I slept quietly. Next morning, however, the storm broke. Miss L and I were peacefully at work in the kitchen when she suddenly caught up a carving knife and started after me, as mad as a March hare. Fortunately for me, I had in my hands a large saucepan full of freshly boiled greens, and I used this as a weapon of defense, and we danced around the kitchen table, slopping hot cabbage water in all directions. We neither of us made a sound. I fended her off with the hot and sooty saucepan, and she slashed at me with an unpleasantly large carving knife. At a psychological moment, in walked the head of the community. He took in the situation at a glance and handled it by the tactful method of scolding us both impartially for making so much noise and telling us to get on with our work. Miss L finished whatever she was doing with the carver. I dished up the cabbage, and the incident passed off quietly. After lunch, Miss L experienced from the reaction from her excitement and went to her room completely prostrated with exhaustion. I was somewhat perturbed. Although used to mental cases and therefore not as disturbed by the recent fracas as anyone else might have been, I did not relish the prospect of being the housemate of a dangerous lunatic who was under no sort of control. The head of the community, however, said there was no cause for alarm. He would soon have the case in hand. He went up to the bathroom, filled a soap dish with water from the tap, made certain passes over it, and dipping his finger in the water, proceeded to draw a 5-pointed star upon the threshold of Miss L's room. Miss L made no attempt to leave her room until 48 hours later, when he fetched her out himself. As he had promised, he soon had her in hand. He had several long talks with her, at which I was not present, and at the end of a few days, a very chastened Miss L began to go about her household duties again. There were relapses and there were struggles, but in the course of a few weeks she became comparatively normal, and when I met her again some 18 months later, there had been no relapse. 2 curious incidents occurred during the period of her treatment at the hands of this man, an adept if ever there was one. The house in which she had a room was a very old one, and the front door exceedingly massive. It was secured at night by 2 enormous bolts that extended right across it, a chain that could have moored a barge, and a huge lock with a key the size of a trowel. When the door was opened in the morning, it acted as an alarm clock for the entire village. It creaked, it groaned, and it clanged. Yet night after night, we came down in the morning to find this door standing ajar. We all slept with our doors open on the small landing. To go down the ancient creaking stairs was like walking on organ stops. The back door was a modern affair, which could have been opened easily. The windows were modern casements of the most grim-cracked description. Who opened the heavy front door and why? We exchanged recriminations several mornings at breakfast as to who had left the door open the night before, but no one could ever be convicted of the blame. Finally, the matter came to the knowledge of the head of the group. "I will soon put a stop to that," he said, and each night he resealed Miss L's room with the pentagram. He had no more trouble with the front door coming open after that. While he was dealing with Miss L, he made a practice of sealing the threshold of his own room in the same way. Only in this case, he drew the pentagram going outwards to prevent Miss D from coming in, whereas when he sealed her room, he put it point inwards to prevent her coming out. She did not know this, nor was it likely to reach her ears indirectly, for he was very uncommunicative. I only knew that he was sealing his room because I chanced to see him doing it. Nevertheless, one day I heard a knock at my door, and there was Miss L, with her arms full of clean linen. She asked me if I would be good enough to take it into the room of the head of the community and put it away. I asked her why she did not do so herself, for I knew he was out, and it was her work to put away the linen. She replied that she had been to his room for that purpose, but there was a psychic barrier across the threshold that prevented her entering. She also asked me, on several occasions, to put inside my frock out of sight a little silver cross that I habitually wore, as she said she could not bear the sight of it. This cross I had purchased just before coming to this occult college, and had taken it to a priest of my acquaintance to be blessed, for I had not been altogether easy in my mind concerning the nature of the group I was joining, and during the early days of my association with it was poised on tiptoe, as it were, ready for instant flight. Naturally, I had kept my own counsel concerning the psychic precautions I had taken against my new friends, and no one was aware that the cross had been specially magnetized against psychic attack. Nevertheless, the woman who would have attacked if she could felt its influence and feared it. Autosuggestion and imagination play so large a part in so-called psychic impressions that one is chary of accepting confirmatory testimony from a psychic who knows what is expected of him. But a spontaneous reaction is, in my opinion, evidential. When the treatment of Miss L had progressed some way towards her final recovery, much interesting information was elicited. She told us that she had distinct memories of dealings with black magic in her previous lives. This, she said, had been confirmed by several independent psychics, and I would certainly have been willing to add my testimony to theirs had I been asked. As a child, she used to daydream that she was a witch, willing the death of misfortune of those who annoyed her. And she also averred, though whether this was true or not I cannot say, that her wishes were so effectual that she was frightened and tried to abandon the practice. She also volunteered that she was in the habit of visualizing herself standing before people she was angry with, scolding them, and projecting malignment force at them. This, of course, would explain our nightmares. She also said that she had been in the habit of attacking her mother and sister in this way, and had made her sister very ill, so that they now refused to have her in the house. This statement was later confirmed by the mother. She told us that she felt as if she were two distinct persons, her normal self being spiritually minded, intensely compassionate and idealistic, her other and lower self, which came to the surface when she was crossed, upset, or overtired, being intensely malicious and subject to paroxysms of hate and cruelty. These characteristics had been particularly marked when she was little, but as she grew older, she recognized the wrongfulness of them, and her lofty idealism represented her endeavor to rise above them. This endeavor was, I am convinced, an honest one. Unfortunately, it was not always successful. She referred to the incident in which she told me to lock my door, and said she had done so in the hope of affording me some measure of protection against the astral projection in which she knew she was tempted to indulge. At first sight, her case had looked like one of obsession and had been so diagnosed by one of two members of the community, but wise handling revealed otherwise. This case reveals another interesting point in that, true to the witch tradition, she had a horror of sacred symbols. She would not occupy a room where there was a picture of a religious subject nothing would induce her to wear any piece of jewelry in the form of a cross, and it was impossible for her to enter a church. This case has many points of interest, especially in the fact that what was apparently a case of well-marked insanity was cleared up by occult methods. End of chapter. Chapter 4. Projection of the Etheric Body. Before we can leave the subject of attack by incarnate human beings, we must consider the subject of etheric projection. In this case, not only is the mind at work, but also which is pretty nearly physical, sufficiently physical at any rate, to leave bruises on the flesh of the victims, throw the furnitures about, or at least make a considerable amount of noise. Where such manifestations take place, it is obvious that we are dealing with something more substantial than the mind. For although mind can influence mind, and through it the body, to an extent to which in the present state of our knowledge it is difficult to set limits, mind cannot manipulate matter directly. That is to say, you cannot smash a window by means of a thought. There must be some physical vehicle that can be manipulated by the mind if effects are to be wrought on the physical plane. The living body is such an instrument. It is manipulated by the mind every time a voluntary movement takes place, and the operations of spiritual healing are simply an extension of this principle to the involuntary muscles and physiological processes not ordinarily directed by the conscious mind. Occultists maintain that mind affects body by means of the etheric double, as it is called, the mortal mind of the Christian Scientist. We may not unreasonably conclude that when physical action is produced at a distance by occult means, it is done by employing this etheric double. The etheric double is primarily a body of magnetic stresses in the framework of whose meshes every cell and fiber of this physical body is held back, as in a rack. But intermediate between this and the defense physical body as we know it, there is what may be called the raw material out of which dense matter is condensed. This was called by the ancients hyli, or first matter, and by the moderns ectoplasm. It is this projected ectoplasm which produces the phenomena whenever physical manifestations are in question. It may be projected as long rods, which will operate up to a distance of a dozen feet or so, or it may be projected as a nebulous cloud, connected with the medium by a tenuous thread. This cloud can be organized into distinct forms, having the semblance of life and acting as vehicles for conscious wills. There is a great deal of information available on this subject in the literature of spiritualism. The adept who was head of the occult college to which I have previously referred, and from whom I received my first training in occultism, was able to perform this operation, and I have many times seen him do it. He would go into deep trance after a few convulsive movements, somewhat like a slow tetany, and would then loose about 2/3 of his weight. I have many times helped to lift him, or even lifted him single-handed when he was in this state, and he weighed no more than a child. A man can fake many things, but he cannot fake his weight. I have lifted him single-handed from the floor onto a sofa when in this state. It is quite true that, being rigid as a board, he was much easier to handle than the ordinary limp, unconscious human form, but there is a certain ratio between the weight of a grown man and the strength of a woman of average physique. What became of the missing weight on these occasions I found out one night. He had been ill with some delirium, and the lion's share of the nursing, especially that night work, had fallen to my lot. There came a time, however, when we decided that he was so far recovered that it was unnecessary for anyone to sit up with him. So to bed we all went. For the first time for several days, I shared a room with another member of the community. It was a comparatively small cottage we were in, and our two beds were close together, side by side, right under the uncurtained open window. It was the time of the full moon, and I remember that I had no need to light a candle in order to see to undress. I fell asleep at once, for I was very tired. I could not have been asleep very long. However, when I was awakened by the sensation of a weight upon my feet, it was as if a good-sized dog, say a collie, had jumped up and lain down on the bed. The room was flooded with moonlight and as bright as day, and I clearly saw, lying apparently asleep across the foot of my bed, the man who we had left safely tucked up for the night in the room below. It was a somewhat embarrassing situation, and I lay still, taking thought before I did anything. I was wide enough awake by now, as may well be imagined. I concluded that Z, as I will call this man, had either had a return of the delirium or was sleepwalking. In any case, I was very anxious to get him safely back to bed again without a fuss or a scene. My companion had a bad heart, and I did not want her to get a shock. Neither did I want him to get a shock in his weak state. I was afraid that if I waked my roommate first, she might scream and wake Z up with a start, with disastrous consequences. I decided therefore to wake him gently, as being the worst case of the two, and let her take her chance. Having cogitated these matters for several moments at least, I finally took action. I sat up in bed and leant quietly forward with the intention of touching him gently on the shoulder and so arousing him. In order to lean forward, I had to withdraw my feet from under him, for they were pinned by his weight, which until now had rested upon them, for I had been careful not to stir while thinking out my plan of campaign. Z was plainly visible in the moonlight, clad apparently in his dressing gown, or so I took the muffling folds of material to be that swathed him about. Both his face and wrappings appeared gray and colorless in the moonlight, but there was no question in my mind as to his solidarity, for not only could I see him, but I could feel his weight resting upon my feet. But the moment I moved, he vanished, and I was left staring in amazement at the smooth fold of the blankets over the end of the little camp on which I lay. It was then, and then only, that I realized he had appeared all gray and colorless, more like a shaded pencil sketch than a human being of flesh and blood. I asked him about this incident in the morning, but he said he had no recollection of it. He had been dreaming the uneasy, broken dreams of a sick man, but could not recall them. This, of course, was in no way an occult attack, but rather the visit of a friend who had come to lean upon me in the course of his illness, and instinctively came to me for consolation when out of his body in trance at a time when his weakened conditions prevented him from retaining his normal control over his psychic activities. Nevertheless, it serves to illustrate what could be done if the etheric form that visited me had been energized by a malignant will. It may explain the nature of the sense of weight that oppresses the victims of a certain type of nightmare. I have heard of more than one case wherein bruises resembling finger marks were found on the throats of people who had been victims of an astral attack. I have never actually seen such bruises myself, but I have been told of them by people who have either had them themselves or seen them. It is a well-known fact that if an occultist functioning out of the body meets the unpleasantness of the astral plane, or if this subtle body is seen and struck or shot at, the physical body will show the marks. I myself have many times found curiously patterned bruises on my body. after an astral skirmish. The mechanism of the production of such marks must, I think, be of the same nature as that which produces the stigmata of saints and the curious physical marks and swelling sometimes seen in hysterics. The mind, powerfully stirred, affects the etheric double, and the etheric double acts upon the physical molecules held in its meshes. I dare to prophesy the next advances in medicine will be bound up with the knowledge of the nature and function of the etheric double. The next type of psychic attack which we must consider is that conducted by means of artificial elements. These are distinguished from thought forms by the fact that, once formulated by the creative mind of the magician, they possess a distinct and independent life of their own. Though strictly conditioned as to nature by the concept of their creator, The life of these creatures is akin to that of an electric battery. It slowly leaks out by means of radiation, and unless recharged periodically, will finally weaken and die out. The whole question of the making, charging, recharging, or destruction of these artificial elements is an important one in practical occultism. The artificial elemental is constructed by forming a clear-cut image in the imagination of the creature it is intended to create, ensouling it with something of the corresponding aspect of one's own being, and then invoking into it the appropriate natural force. This method can be used for good as well as evil, and guardian angels are formed in this way. It is said that dying women, anxious concerning the welfare of their children, frequently form them unconsciously. I myself once had an exceedingly nasty experience in which I formulated a werewolf accidentally. Unpleasant as the incident was, I think it may be just as well to give it publicity, for it shows what may happen when an insufficiently disciplined and purified nature is handling occult forces. I had received serious injury from someone who, at considerable cost to myself, I had disinterestedly helped, and I was sorely tempted to retaliate. Lying on my bed resting one afternoon, I was brooding over my resentment, and while so brooding, I drifted towards the borders of sleep. There came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraints and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf horror of the north. Immediately I felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. It was well materialized ectoplasmic form, like Z. It was gray and colorless, and like him, it had weight. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as if it lay beside me on the bed as a large dog might. I knew nothing about the art of making elementals at the time, but had accidentally stumbled upon the right method, the brooding highly charged with emotion, the invocation of the appropriate natural force, and the condition between sleeping and waking in which the etheric double readily extrudes. I was horrified at what I had done, and knew I was in a tight corner and that everything depended upon my keeping my head. I had had enough experience of practical occultism to know that the thing I had called into visible manifestation could be controlled by my will, provided I did not panic, but that if I lost my nerve and it got the upper hand, I had Frankenstein monster to cope with. I stirred slightly, and the creature evidently objected to being disturbed, for it turned its long snout towards me over its shoulder and snarled, showing its teeth. I had now got the wind up properly, but I knew that everything depended on my getting the upper hand and keeping it, and that the best thing I could do was to fight it out now, because the longer the thing remained in existence, the stronger it would get, and the more difficult to disintegrate. So I drove up my elbow into its hairy ectoplasmic ribs and said to it out loud, "If you can't behave yourself, you will have to go on the floor," and pushed it off the bed. Down it went, meek as a lamb, and changed from wolf to dog, to my great relief. Then the corner of the room appeared to fade away, and the creature went out through the gap. I was far from happy, however, for I had a feeling that this was not the end of it, and my feeling was confirmed when next morning another member of my household reported that her sleep had been disturbed by dreams of wolves, and she awakened in the night to see the eyes of a wild animal shining in the darkness in the corner of her room. Now thoroughly alarmed, I went off to seek advice from one whom I have always looked up on as my teacher, and I was told that I had made this thing out of my own substance by revengeful thoughts, and that it was really a part of myself extruded, and that I must at all costs recall it and reabsorb it into myself, at the same time foregoing my desire to settle accounts with the person who had injured me. Curiously enough, just at this time, there came an opportunity most effectually to settle with my antagonist. Fortunately for all concerned, I had enough sense left to see that I was at the dividing of the ways, and if I were not careful, would take the first step on to the left-hand path. If I availed myself of the opportunity to give practical expression to my resentment, the wolf form would be born into an independent existence, and there would be the devil to pay, literally as well as metaphorically. I received the distinct impression, and impressions are important things in psychic matters, for they often represent subconscious knowledge and experience, that once the wolf impulse had found expression in action, the wolf form would sever the psychic navel cord that connected it with my solar plexus, and it would be no longer possible for me to absorb it. The prospect was not a pleasant one. I had to forego my dearly loved revenge and allow harm to be done to me without defending myself, and I also had to summon and absorb a wolf form which, to my psychic consciousness at any rate, looked unpleasantly tangible. Nor was I in a situation in which I could either ask for assistance nor expect much sympathy. However, it had to be faced, and I knew that with every hour of the thing's existence, it would be harder to deal with. So I made the resolution to let the opportunity for revenge slip through my fingers, and at first dusk summoned the creature. It came in through the northern corner of the room again. Subsequently, I learned that the north was considered among the ancients as the evil quarter, and presented itself upon the hearthrug in quite a mild and domesticated mood. I obtained an excellent materialization in the half-light, and could have sworn that a big Alsatian was standing there looking at me. It was tangible, even to the dog-like odor. From it to me stretched a shadowy line of ectoplasm. One end was attached to my solar plexus, and the other disappeared in the shaggy fur of its belly, but I could not see the actual point of attachment. I began by an effort of the will and imagination to draw the life out of it along this silver cord, as if sucking lemonade up a straw. The wolf form began to fade. The cord thickened and grew more substantial. A violent emotional upheaval started in myself. I felt the most furious impulses to go berserk and rend and tear anything and anybody that came to hand, like the Malay running amok. I conquered this impulse with an effort, and the upheaval subsided. The wolf form had now faded into a shapeless gray mist. This too absorbed along the silver cord. The tension relaxed, and I found myself bathed in perspiration. That, as far as I know, was the end of the incident. I had had a sharp lesson, and highly instructive one. It may not be convincing to other people, owing to the lack of corroborative evidence, but it was exceedingly evidential to me, and I put it on record for what it is worth to those who, having personal knowledge of these things, can see its significance. It is a curious point that, during the brief 24 hours of the thing's life, the opportunity for an effectual vengeance presented itself. End of chapter. If you're ready for a little spookiness, well, join me at the next video, as the author is going to be covering two very interesting topics: vampirism and hauntings. Please do make sure to hit the like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe to the channel.